Good morning and a warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to our third episode of Africa Talks. My IJP colleague Ika and me, we are welcoming all of you today. We want to build a digital platform for exchange of African and European topics, exchange of knowledge and ideas between journalists and experts from civil society from both continents. And we want to talk about impacts and consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Vollmar, and I'm member of the board of the International Journalist Programs. I would like to introduce to you my colleague Ika.
Hello, my name is Ika Neumann, and I'm the coordinator of the African program of the International Journalism Program. And I'm very excited to have you all here today and looking forward to a very important and also very interesting discussion.
Our topic for today, the poor lose again. Is COVID-19 pushing the African continent into poverty? Before the COVID-19 crisis, poverty rates in Africa were expected to decline. On the contrary, the recession that the coronavirus pandemic generated will increase poverty rates throughout the continent. This might lead to additional 26 to 58 million people in the sub-Saharan region who will fall into extreme poverty conditions. Forecasts also predict that some of the 170 million people who make up the fledgling African middle classes, 8 million all in all, could fall back into poverty. To discuss these topics and to deepen our understanding of knowledge, we have invited excellent guests. Ruwandzano Makumbe is a lawyer and special project consultant for the Zimbabwe Human Rights Association, ZimRights. It is Zimbabwe's biggest grassroots movement of ordinary people from human rights. Formed in 1992, for the past 27 years, ZimRights has empowered communities through civics education, legal aid support, psychosocial support, and community advocacy strategies to ensure the realization of basic rights, especially for the most marginalized communities. In this process, ZimRights membership has increased to over 225,000 individual members equipped and empowered to claim their rights. And now we're coming to our next guest.
I would like to introduce to you Professor Michael Klundt. He is a professor and an expert in child poverty and child rights at the Faculty of the Applied Human Science at the University of Applied Science Magdeburg-Stendal. And he is a well-known expert in tackling topics like child rights,
Mase Ramaru is a community organizer and feminist advocate. Based in Cape Town, South Africa, she's working for human rights and gender issues. And this is our round for today. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the participation of Mr. Vollmar due to a technical problem which we were facing. We apologize for that. Ika?
Yes. So please continue. I'm just have you heard me when I introduced Mr.
Not all the things,
Mr. Klundt?
But
oh, okay. So let me quickly continue. So Mr. Klundt was he's a special expert on child poverty and children's rights, So he is also a requested expert, for example, for the German Parliament, a special expert. And so he was asked the other day to give his insight in front of the parliamentarians in connection children's rights and COVID-19. So that would be very interesting to hear from him later on. And now we would start with Ruwandzano, Makumbe first. And before we start, I would like to introduce also to you Wiebke Koch, who is a graphic recorder and who would take notes of our talk today. And yes, we will see at the end, we will see again what she designed. So Wiebke.
Good morning, everyone, or hello, depending on your time of the day where you listen. I'm very honored to be able to support these Africa Talks with visual notes, and I look forward to what I hear and learn from this one. You will get a visual summary of this talk by the end of the conversation, and it will be uploaded on the website later in the week as well. Thank you.
So we will get back to you at the end of the talk and see what you got from it. So Ruwandzano, Makumbe, could you please make the start and start your presentation? We are most excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Aka, and thank you, Marco. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this important discussion. And I think I'll take this time to try and share the experiences of communities in Zimbabwe and highlight some of the issues that are pertinent to a discussion such as this one, but also some of the issues that we feel are closely related to questions of poverty, to questions of the availability or unavailability of safety nets. I will also speak with an understanding that some of these issues are important for us to think about them, especially now when we are looking into how are we going to recover from the effects of the pandemic, and also how can we best equip ourselves to live a better life after the pandemic. So as we all know, the pandemic came at a time when the world was grappling with various global challenges, including climate change, global injustices, and systemic inequality. Even the most developed countries were not fully prepared to deal with the public health emergency of this magnitude. And Zimbabwe, as you can imagine, was further low in the resource index, having suffered blows of constant economic decline in the last 2 decades as a result of various factors, including misrule and poor governance. At the fore is a poor healthcare system, which falls short of the bare minimum provided in the United Nations Universal Health Coverage, including a lack of financial risk protection, access to equality, essential healthcare services, and access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for all. So the situation in Zimbabwe had already been devastating for many way before the pandemic. However, these challenges have been further amplified as this year because of the pandemic, with many households now at the edge of facing starvation. Many also lost their source of livelihoods through the informal sector as the national lockdown was put into effect in March 2020, and borders into countries such as neighboring South Africa and Botswana were closed, hampering cross-border trading. This is against a backdrop of government lockdown without a plan. So we talk of the fact that there were no safety nets for the poor or emergency financial injections into the public healthcare system. Social life in Zimbabwe is premised on community and family, and requirements put in place such as social distancing and restricted movement presented challenges for many. For example, churches, family gatherings, and social networks were certainly interrupted. The consequences of this, as you would imagine, would include increased levels of stress, increased alcohol intake, as well as domestic violence cases in the home. Due to these challenges being amplified and exposed, this period has sort of made us rethink of a lot of things, but one of the things that I think is very important is that it has rehashed the importance of community and service. Grassroots communities, civil society organizations, and the private sector have stepped in to provide support and services to the most vulnerable. We saw a lot of donations being presented to our elderly, to people living with disabilities, to those who were facing challenges during this period. And most of the support that was going into the communities was not really coming from the government, but coming from ordinary people like you and me. Throughout this period, Zimrights has played a significant role in supporting communities with a platform to share their experiences and visions for Zimbabwe, and in the process influence policies and actions taken to mitigate losses as a result of COVID-19. Zimrights had a COVID-19 response strategy which collated community voices and documented these stories in 9 human rights monitoring reports. We did a special report, which I will also share with everyone, because I think it's quite interesting in the fact that it shows how we can draw lessons from the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, but also it shows how people in Zimbabwe were affected, and takes those voices and tries to show that with all this that has happened, there's still a possibility that we can take it as a lesson and move forward. So I will try to highlight now the issues of poverty and, well, a lack of safety nets for the vulnerable during this period. Prior to COVID-19, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food conducted a country visit to Zimbabwe in 2019. He highlighted that widespread poverty, limited employment opportunities, liquidity challenges, pervasive corruption, economic instability, mismanagement of funds, natural disaster, recurring droughts, and economic sanctions and conditionalities had all contributed to Zimbabwe's crisis, which had been ongoing for decades. Also, the World Food Programme noted that Zimbabwe was in a food deficit with more than 7.7 million people, which is half of the population facing food insecurity in 2020. So widespread poverty, HIV, AIDS, limited employment opportunities, recurring climate-induced shocks, and economic instability all contributed to limiting adequate access to food. So there has also been a reduction in the agricultural outputs, which is quite significant in Zimbabwe because it's a farming country, from including the rural subsistence farmers, which affected food security for various households. So this is important because we are talking at the ordinary level where, for example, my parents are subsistence farmers and that's how they get their livelihood. But because of climate change, because of lack of financial support, there has been trouble for farmers to be able to produce as much as they would, specifically for their farmers. And we are not even talking about commercial farming here. We're talking about farming at the subsistence level. So for instance, there were minimal shortages in April, which forced people to ignore the precautions to social distancing and to stay at home. People found themselves in a precarious position where they want to protect themselves from infection, but they also require food to feed their families. This also means that social distance is difficult, was difficult, and still remains difficult, and almost impossible as hundreds are queuing to access maize meal. And even when we look at the structure in which informal businesses operate, we have our markets. How do people social distance in a very busy market such as Mbari? Those are questions that we were asking. Is it even possible to tell people to stay at home? Is it possible to tell people not to go to these markets during this period, which is the centrality of where people make their money through informal businesses? So most households, therefore, are spending the little money that they had to buy food to sustain themselves during the lockdown. And for many families, the food was still insufficient. Self-isolation really would have resulted in many families facing starvation if there was no extra support provided. I will also highlight that the lockdown measures and food security and poverty in Zimbabwe were not compatible. So obviously the regulations and restrictions that were put in place were low, and the police exhibited insensitivity, brutality and flagrant disregard for human rights in trying to enforce those regulations. A clear example is the burning of huge quantities of food from the poor at Sakuva Market in Mutare. Another example is the reports from residents that their right to freedom from torture, granted in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, Section 53, was violated by the police while they were dispersing several people gathered at various water points, including public and private boreholes, to fetch water for domestic use. So you can see that these are everyday issues relating to, obviously, standard of living, but also relating to people's human rights, because the compatibility of the restrictions and the regulations that were put in place to protect people from the spread of the virus were not matching with the social needs and also the economic status of the country. So during this period, the equality gap has widened, leaving the poor and vulnerable excessively exposed to starvation, malnutrition, and extreme poverty. The informal sector has provided most households with a stringent source of income, and with the lockdown, this became a non-viable source of income sufficient enough to provide for the next meal. For instance, one of the vital economic lifelines for Zimbabwe is cross-border trading into neighboring countries, South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, and Mozambique. Borders were closed, and this put a halt on all travel. Due to the economic instabilities in the country, many families could not afford to buy basic groceries and commodities in the country as the prices fluctuate, and there were also shortages of food. South Africa was an alternative source for affordable groceries, and the coronavirus pandemic will therefore have negative impacts on the economies of most African countries. So because of this interconnectivity in terms of Zimbabwe relying on South Africa for basic groceries, because the groceries in Zimbabwe are quite expensive. So there is not sufficient system of welfare support in place. And earlier in the year, the government had said that they were going to administer around 600 million Zimbabwean dollars cash transfer program that was meant to target 1 million vulnerable households over this commendable. When you closely look at it, you can tell that it was not sufficient to ensure that the vulnerable in our society were well sheltered and well provided for during this period. And I will also look at other factors, so relating to how the government responded to COVID-19, particularly in relation to people's everyday lives, and also see whether this was effective and efficient. The first item that I think is quite important is the status of the healthcare system in Zimbabwe. So the healthcare system and its preparedness to combat COVID-19 in Zimbabwe was obviously at the top of our minds, and was one of the issues that was worrying everyone, to say, well, way before COVID-19 hit, the healthcare system in Zimbabwe was very weak. So how are we going to be able to manage in the event that COVID-19 affects a lot of people? So we worked with medical experts, and they highlighted that the health system in Zimbabwe has been falling apart for a long time now as a result of the government. As a result, during this period, and when COVID-19 hit, the government had to stretch the little resources that it had to fight COVID-19. Was this sufficient? Was this efficient? And was it effective? That's another question. So in the report that we published, which I will share the link to, the Zimrites noted that from both the national perspective as well as the community perspective, people understood that we certainly had a weak healthcare system. It was undeniable that the healthcare system in Zimbabwe was in shambles, and we were therefore nowhere close to being prepared to deal with COVID-19. There are doctors that also contributed to these discussions who have been working in the healthcare system and advocating for the need to pay more attention to the public health sector. They even highlighted that the state of the healthcare system is a result of poor governance in terms of financial and resource management. This further was made worse by the absence of transparency and accountability measures. And this means that actions have gone unchecked for years, and the worst hit by this failing system are ordinary Zimbabweans. So the right to health, as we all know, is a right that is well protected under international law and which has to be treated as such. But the Zimbabwean government has sort of failed to ensure that people access that right, people actually understand that they have that right, because our healthcare system is very weak. It has been very clear that the crisis in Zimbabwe is much more than the pandemic. It is the healthcare system that makes it unlikely for pregnant mothers to welcome home their unborn babies. And a few months ago, we saw reports of how in one night, there were 9 babies who were born, and 7 of them passed on that very night. That is a very unfortunate case, and those are cases of death and that could have been avoided. So one thing that the pandemic has done is to make the people realize how really bad the situation is, particularly bad in the sense that it affects everyone's lives, and that there is need for everyone to take action in terms of restructuring the manner in which our healthcare system operates. It has also made it clear that it is important to invest in national health and healthcare institutions for the benefit of everyone, including our political leaders, particularly so because accessing the best healthcare services in China or South Africa should not be a default state for everyone, because the majority of Zimbabweans do not afford that. And then another factor that was closely related to poverty and the manner in which everyday lives were affected by the state of human rights, rule of law, and how the emergency powers were implemented. I've talked briefly on this and how people were brutalized when they went out to get water from community boreholes, or how people were assaulted when they found themselves in queues looking for maize meal. The declaration of a state of emergency in the country on human rights and rule of law had serious impact on our society, in as much as there was obviously the need to have measures to combat the spread of the virus. There was also need to have a balance in terms of human rights and understanding the context within which these restrictions were being implemented. So we know the Syracuse principles provide that any restrictions of fundamental rights imposed by the government in the public interest must be justifiable and legal, based on a legitimate objective, strictly necessary in a democratic society, and not arbitrary, unreasonable, or discriminatory. The heavy-handedness by the police and the military in Zimbabwe did not match these requirements. There was also no serious consideration of the UN position that a state of emergency or any other security measures should be guided by human rights principles and should not in any circumstances be an excuse to quash dissent.
Thank you, Ruwandzano.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that first input. We want to discuss it later on in this 60 minutes, and I'm I'm more than honored now that we have Michael Klundt in our round here, and the floor is yours, Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Good day, good morning, good night. Welcome. Thank you for your invitation. I was asked to talk about manifestations of poverty, about Corona and poverty, about concepts in Germany. As we heard soon from, for example, from our Minister for Development, Müller, we have to take into account that worldwide we will have, at the end of all this crisis, we will have more dead victims from the lockdown and from the Corona measures than from the pandemic itself, especially in poor countries, developing countries, so-called third world countries. I want to say this first before I come to Germany, because when we talk about manifestations of poverty in Germany, it's clear we have the 60% of the national median, not the average equivalized income. This is our, for the European Union, this is our poverty line, if you want so. And we rather talk about relative poverty than absolute poverty. We talk in Germany about more than 13 million people around them 2 to 4 million children. We talk about jobless or people in precarious work. We talk about sorts of exclusion or disadvantage in education, health, housing, cultural and infrastructural participation in social networks, sports, well-being, and so on. It's clear when we talk about poverty in Germany, we do not talk about poverty in Germany in the Middle Ages or shortly after the Second World War. We talk about poverty in Germany now in the year 2020 in one of the richest countries on earth. So it is less about absolute misery and starvation, but more about privation, exclusion, and disadvantage in relation to the general social standard of living. Which means if almost everyone has a refrigerator or television, school bag, for example, it is unfair if some are excluded from them. Nevertheless, we can also find in rich Germany forms of absolute poverty. We have to deal with more than 600, 700,000 homeless people now. Around them, 37,000 young people. We have thousands of people who are collecting bottles, who are begging or having to live on food charities. All these forms are sorts of absolute poverty. But nevertheless, in one of the richest countries on earth, it's rather relative deprivation, exclusion, disadvantages in relation to the general social standard of living. This means the quality of life, education, health, and future prospects of children are massively influenced by growing up in poverty. They often live disproportionately in deprived conditions and therefore usually without a quiet place to do their homework. While the permanent shortage worsens the family climate, the social networks are also smaller as the children also take advantage of fewer leisure activities, be it music schools or football clubs. Not least because of a lack of social appreciation, many poor children therefore develop a lower self-esteem and start school with less chances, where they are often rated and treated worse than children from wealthier classes, even with the same performance. Now development in Germany, Corona and poverty. The sparse empirical studies available can show on family and child poverty during the Corona crisis can show us that the social polarization has not been reduced, but rather appears even more clearly than before. Corona crisis did not and does not have the same effect on all families and children. Children in poverty under precarious living conditions are particularly hit hard by the contact bans, play, sport, and exercise bans, the lockdown and exclusions from education. Homeless youths or refugee children were hit even worse in mass accommodation where no one could or can do social distancing. On the other hand, those who live with a private garden, with a pool, with their indoor playground in their home, perceived the lockdown completely different than someone with several people in far too few small rooms in a tiny apartment with an unhealthy living environment and poor technical equipment, with parents who are in fear of their economic existence, who lose a significant part of their salary or even their jobs, or have to fear daily infections due to a lack of home office opportunities. In my study, Crisis-Friendly Children instead of Child-Friendly Crisis Management in Germany, I have shown that the rights to protection, care, and participation of children and adolescents were violated in the Corona crisis. The measures also increased the problem of child poverty. Playgrounds were closed for a long time in the first phase of the Corona crisis. Practically all political decisions and measures during this time were in violation of international law and contrary to federal law, without giving priority to the best interest of the child, according to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is federal law in Germany. Children could have had to suffer particularly from restrictions such as the blocking of contacts, the exclusion from education, and the ban on play and sports fields. The situation of the families was also in the background. The easing debate. The needs of children and adolescents were almost non-existent. They also felt that they were reduced to their role as pupils, while almost all other non-school areas of youth experience had been completely ignored. The sparse studies available so far have shown that the social divide has widened. Children in poverty and precarious living conditions were hit particularly hard by the corona measures. Now, the concepts against the crisis. I think we should talk about social protection and compensation for workers, families, and children. Child rights-based measures like protection, provision, and participation with a priority for best interest of the child are necessary. Special support for children and youth, non-school infrastructures for play, sports, cultural activities, social contact and communication, and standards for digital participation are needed. In addition, alternatives and counter strategies linked to children's perspectives should combine concepts of poverty reduction, the participation of young people, and the promotion of social infrastructure. These concepts should not ignore the socio-political context. This includes three central demands. First of all, measures against poverty and for social security for children and families. Second, the child rights principles of the child's best interests, protection, promotion, and above all, the participation of children, young people, and youth associations must be established and implemented or re-established. Thirdly, this would involve measures for a pandemic-sensible expansion of the social infrastructure in the residential area, especially through so-called youth welfare and open work, youth work, in the area of social and public infrastructure. Therefore, savings or cuts must be avoided, must not be made. So I can talk about some other things, but 9 minutes is okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Klundt. That was very, very informative and very much to the point. So we are now very happy and will continue. Before we engage into a discussion, we will continue with Mase Ramaru. Maybe Marco, you quickly introduce her so that we. Okay, so
sure, I can do
yes,
so. Sure, I can do so. Again, because it was a bit due to our technical problems at the beginning, it was maybe a bit too fast. Mase Ramaru, we are very happy to have you here in our round. She's a community organizer and feminist advocate, and based in Cape Town in South Africa, and she's working for women's rights and gender issues. And we are very happy that we have you here, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I think that my colleague in Zimbabwe has laid the landscape for the region quite well, because I think so many of our experiences intersect in very deep ways. And so when they were talking, I was kind of reflecting on our own experience here in South Africa, and the impact on, you know, the national, the provincial, and then the local level. And of course, the local level being the most affected. But I mean, what's quite clear is that what the lockdown has revealed, as it's being reiterated many times, is that, you know, it's highlighted a lot of the issues within South Africa, within the region, and within Africa. And I think statistics have a very interesting way of portraying an image, but you know, the experiences are quite personal themselves, and people's experiences and what they've, you know, what the COVID-19 has meant for them in a real sense, so much deeper than that. And what we know in South Africa is that already before the pandemic, we had, you know, South Africa has many tiers, what we call tiers of poverty, where we have people who, you know, just the perimeter of existence in South Africa in terms of economic well-being and socioeconomic access, where we have a 1%, so that's quite minimal, and then we have quite an inflated middle class, but it's a middle class that's transitioning between being quite comfortable and also bordering the lines of poverty. And then the most inflated part of the existence of South African people are people in the category of poor, right, who are categorized as poor, transitional poor, and the chronically poor. And so for me, the interest lies in the idea of a chronically poor and the impacts of COVID-19. And I want to also maybe just put it out there that I think we still have not felt the impact of the pandemic, right? And I think it's still we're still kind of navigating through it, and it's quite unimaginable for this period. And as things unfold, and as we kind of start to settle into this new normal, we'll start to kind of understand the impact, the greater impact, and what it means for everyday South Africans and everyday African, for that matter. And I mean, for us in South Africa, and not trying to kind of reiterate a lot of the stuff that has come up already, COVID-19 has exposed the dysfunctionality, firstly, of the state, of state apparatus, and the basic care for South African citizens and South African people. And mostly we saw this during the South African lockdown, which we're still under, by the way. So South Africa went under lockdown on the 27th of March of this year. And it's been extended. The lockdown has been in full effect since then. We've got a stage system where the stage system kind of dictates levels of economic activity, gatherings, and so from that time, things have transitioned a little bit, and economic activity has loosened a bit. But the impacts that it's had on everyday people is being felt in a very deep way. And we also see that there's been great losses that have been suffered, of course, at a national level, but also in local economies, which I want to kind of focus on. And I mean, South African lockdown has been extended to the 15th of December with a possible extension. And we know that with continuous extensions, there are implications for people of different industries, of who depend on income in very particular ways. But for me, the interest has been particularly for local economies in South Africa, where we know that even with somewhat of an up and down economic system and an economic system that gives us benefits sometimes, but most times, local people have to depend on local economies. Local economies have been the worst hit, because under level 5 of the South African lockdown, we saw a general closure of businesses on large scale and small scale businesses. And why the local economy in South Africa is important is because the everyday South African person actually depends on the local economy to feed their households. So it has great impact, because we have an unemployment issue in South Africa. And so South Africans do depend on these local economies. And what the impact has been is that the everyday home sellings and vendoring have been closed down, which means that households in South Africa have been gravely impacted, which of course impacts people's abilities to feed their families to eat. And that's why we speak about an increase in a hunger crisis in South Africa, where people have struggled to access basic needs, food, and to keep fed. And we know, and I'll go into this a little bit, one of the state interventions that have come up from the coronavirus has been the food relief programs, where the South African government started with giving out food parcels to households. But of course, we can't account for every household in South Africa, and we don't know what the implications have been for every household. So that in itself has caused great unrest in South Africa in general, in different communities. From the food system, as the system started to develop a little bit and we started to settle a little bit in COVID-19 and its impact, we saw the transition to food vouchers. But I think even these interventions cannot kind of make up for the great impact and the unpreparedness of COVID-19, which of course also exposes the general unpreparedness of the state to deal with any large-scale disaster or any impending pandemic. As the months have gone by, things have improved quite significantly. But of course, because of the impact of corruption, which I'll kind of speak on a little bit, and inconsistent systems, we still see large communities of people who can't organize, who can't access food, who can't access basic needs, who can't even, have something to eat on a daily basis, which of course impacts people's ability to even contribute generally to their communities and organize generally. Second, and one of the things that we've all kind of consistently has been consistent throughout the region and the world are the job losses and the impact of the coronavirus on people's job retention, or on job seekers too. We've seen an increase in unemployment in the South African context, especially amongst young people. In about June of this year, we had the South African census released on unemployment, the stats on unemployment. And young people accounted for 60.4% of unemployment in South Africa, which was already a looming number before the coronavirus pandemic hit. And of course, in comparison, in South Africa, we're sitting, the unemployment rate is sitting generally across the board at 30% at this point, if it hasn't tipped a little bit. We know that this, of course, impacts people's right to self-determination and the ability for them to provide for themselves, and to contribute to a very ailing economy. And because some sectors are still not open in the country, we actually had an address by the president yesterday, who announced that there'll be concessions with some sectors. But because of this need to balance the control of the spread of the virus, and also opening up the economy, we find poor people at the center of this juggle. We find poor people at the center of not being able to access services, not being able to be part of particular industries, and not being able to sufficiently job seek. And I mean, I want to highlight something that's quite important. I think also when we start to see the ripple effects of C-19, and especially for poor communities who often depended on different avenues to keep their families fed, to keep their families going, and it's part of it is school closure. And I know the colleague from Germany has touched briefly on on children's rights, but school closures in South Africa have been also a big contributor to the food crisis or the hunger crisis in South Africa, because the South African system for learners who go to school that we categorize as quintile 1 to 3 schools or quintile 1 to 4 schools, which are often schools, no fee paying schools, and schools for underprivileged and poor communities, provide food relief, have a food relief system for the young people who attend the school. So young people can leave their homes where possibly, even generally before the pandemic, there was hardly anything to eat, can get something to eat at school, and could be sustained and could learn in that period. But what we've seen with the school closure is that even that element has been removed, and that safety net has been removed for a lot of communities and for a lot of households. There's been a lot of organizing that's happened across different parts of the country with different civil society organizations who've tried to organize around the idea of the food system and thinking of alternative ways of still having school feeding schemes running, whereas communities and homes can be supported, and parents can also act in some way to kind of bridge this gap of food hunger. So if a parent can accompany their child to go and get a meal from school or any other alternative, but of course in an impending pandemic, something like a food crisis that affects young people is often neglected, or children rather, is often neglected and doesn't get the attention that it needs. In this period, of course, we have to highlight the relationship that exists between gender-based violence in South Africa, in the region, and globally, and poverty, and how the desperate levels of poverty, joblessness, inaccessible income have impacted the increase in gender-based violence, and also, of course, the lockdown. The lockdown has been an aggravating period for us to also see the fluctuation of numbers around reportings around gender-based violence. And I'm highlighting reportings because we don't know how many other unreported cases there are. But the reportings are telling us that even with the lockdown, and I mean, and for the beginning of the lockdown, we faced deep levels of militarization and securitization on South African streets, where you know, we've seen reports of people who've been who've experienced great bodily harm and who've lost their lives at the hands of the military and the police. But this somehow did not bridge the gap and support in alleviating or combating, rather not even alleviating, combating the levels of reporting around gender-based violence in South Africa. And we're seeing this increase, particularly in low-income households, where the frustration has impacted people. And you know, and it's been interesting because during the early parts of the lockdown, South Africa had a ban on alcohol. And the motivation that we were given is that part of the ban of alcohol will see a reduce in gender-based violence numbers, but it was the contrary, which kind of reiterates what we've been saying, that the issue is bigger than just alcohol and alcohol abuse. The issue is bigger. It's rooted in South African histories. It's deeply connected to poverty and people's access to income and the ability to protect and care for themselves. And it's also rooted in deep histories of colonial and apartheid segregation. I mean, we've, you know, part of
Mase,
the
I would like, thank you so much, Mase. For now, we just would want, that was a very brilliant, very informative presentation, and we would like now to engage into a discussion and have a few questions for the last 12 minutes left. And so it would be nice if everybody of you could still have time to answer the questions. So I have one question which I would like to ask to all of you. Maybe everybody could come up with a quick response. There are studies which predict that interpersonal relationships are transformed, and we now have heard a lot of government's involvement and government's measures which have effect on the poor. But I was wondering if social distancing and the measures do this also implies on the traditional welfare system or the social welfare system which is there in different societies, especially in different African societies, where spiritual, religious groups are support mechanisms, where families are support mechanisms. Could you just come up with some ideas and some observations from your end? Maybe Ruwandzano could start.
Certainly. There was obviously an interruption in terms of the social system and also the social support system that is available for people. But I think it's important for me to highlight that during this period, we saw that there was a push in terms of uptake of internet connectivity, uptake of digital platforms, and how people started to interact. So, for example, churches at the time were limited in terms of the number of people who could meet, and for a certain period of time during the lockdown, churches were actually closed. And also funerals, for example, people were limited in terms of the number of people that could meet for a gathering such as a funeral, or even just the generality of everyday life, which is premised on people going out to socialize. So that was definitely interrupted. But also what we saw is that people moved, or people tried to shift to adjust through having church services via Facebook Live or via YouTube or whatever form that they could still communicate. Of course, this is without its burden in terms of the digital divides that we have in the country, and also a lack of infrastructure for good quality internet connection. And in some rural areas, there isn't that connectivity. But also I will highlight that when we look at rural Zimbabwe, for example, that is where I think one of the important lessons from COVID-19 have been, is that when COVID-19 started, we saw a movement from people from the urban areas moving to the rural areas because they said, well, we feel safer in the rural areas, and that was quite genuine, and it also showed the reliance of people on their rural homes, and the reason why most people find themselves in the urban areas, which is for their sustenance and also income on a day-to-day basis. But I think you're certainly right that there was interruption, but at the same time, people tried to adapt, people tried to find ways to make life livable. People are still trying to find ways to make life livable within this new normal.
Thank you very much. Mr. Klundt, we have the same observations that those people who could afford, or some of those people who could afford, would migrate or spend more time in the rural areas than in the cities. Would you also see, our question is always, where is there hope? What can we do, and how could we really work in a sense towards narrowing the gaps, which are obviously increasing right now through the pandemic and through the measures within the pandemic? Would you have ideas to share? What could be ways forward?
And may I add one more question, Michael? Sorry, to add one more question, because all of you talked about dysfunctional structural reasons, which came up, which were exposed through COVID-19, and I really wonder whether we could find learnings or kind of solutions how we can overcome these structural reasons for poverty. And maybe you could also add on this question.
And certainly in 2 minutes. Give hope in 2 minutes. Okay, I will try. Thank you.
Of course.
I think it's it's interesting that that there were similar reactions in the European nations, as my colleague told about Zimbabwe, because we had the same tendencies at the beginning, that rather the richer people try to go to the rural areas. But there are also traditional changes which we have to take into account. Take, for example, the churches, the religion, when you can't go together because there are risks. The culture, the sports, their signification for the society now is in the great discussion in our society. Which signification is culture? Is culture something which you can add, or is culture also something which is really something? It's the same thing as you can eat if you want. But we have to take into account, when we talk about the children, we had 1.5 billion who were excluded worldwide. Then we had, from one day to another, my colleague in South Africa told you the same thing. We had worldwide 370 million children, school children, who from one day to another had no meals in school. And which is interesting, we had on another level, but we had the same tendencies in Germany too, where also 1 to 3 million pupils get their free meals in school or in daycare. And from one day to another, they didn't have. So, and we have in the same time about a third, which means 463 million pupils who had no, in the whole 4 months, had no substitute lessons. That we have to take into account. So we can say, for many people there were changes, the relations changed perhaps, sometimes perhaps there was even progress. But on the other hand, we have to take into account that many people were very disadvantaged and excluded from this situation. And there, when you ask me, where can we find the hope we can find, for example, when I talk about Germany, I have to take into account that this country is so rich as it never was before. So, and there are many who really made a good euro in this crisis. So we have to redistribute wealth. It's really like this. We have to redistribute wealth. We have to look at, for example, as our Minister for Development says too, we have not only to look in our European countries for solidarity, but also for the African countries, and to help. You want to restart also economic relations with more solidarity than the EPAs and sanctions and other forms of economic policies were before. And then when we work together, then we can have can have hope. But if we only look at our own country, nationalistic or Eurocentric, and we don't realize what happens behind the walls, then there are really big problems who won't be reduced. And we have to think also that there is a difference between risks and real reasons. That's what the colleagues said also. The risks is, for example, unemployment, migration status, being single parent in a single parent status, divorce or something like this. But this is a reason. You hear me again?
Yeah, we hear you again.
Yeah,
yeah,
the reasons are rather the underlying causes in the existing economic and social systems. The health system, we can improve our health system. And what we have to say also, especially for Germany, we have the money to do this. We are really, really rich to do this, to work to improve the health system and not to reduce the health system as we did the last decades, and to privatize the health system as we did the last decades. We have to improve it. And then we have to improve with the other colleagues, with the other countries, and then we can get rid of this pandemic situation and of this COVID crisis.
Thank you, Michael. Mase, what are your learnings out of that?
I mean, just briefly, I wanted to, some of the stuff that I wanted to bring in to my presentation, and I'll just skim through them briefly around the opportunities that have come up during this period. And I think, I mean, both colleagues have kind of reiterated the ways that people have kind of needed to reconfigure their lives. But I think my colleague from Germany has highlighted that, like, a lot of these reconfigurations have a lot to do with people's access and what they've been able to, how they're able to pay for things, and, you know, are they able to negotiate moving into different spaces. But a lot of our communities, we've seen that there's been a minimal uptake of this just because people can't do it. And so as much as social interactions have transformed, but they've also stayed the same because people have had to prioritize their well-being. And I speak in reference of what, you know, in South Africa, we've seen a surge of what we call community action networks, where communities have come together to strategize around how to support the immediate needs of their fellow community members, whether it's you know, food security, whether it's safety. We've seen communities come together, and unfortunately, part of it is while things have transformed, they've had to come and organize with their physical bodies, you know, and that's what it means to not have access to sit across from somebody or connect virtually. And of course, this has been done with observation for social distancing and the new new guidelines for engagement. But we still see a reconvening of people. We still see people organizing in very physical ways, and that's been impactful because while there's been measures of government interventions, communities have had to see themselves through, and community interventions have been the most responsive to date. In terms of spiritual uptake, I mean, in South Africa, there's been a very interesting trend in the recent months where we've seen people seeking, support from this space of African spirituality. In particular, traditional healers have kind of been spotlighted in this period, and traditional medicine has somehow been seen as an option or alternative to, an option for healing, not an alternative to healing. And we've seen in South Africa people using things like lingang as we've been looking for a vaccine for the pandemic. But uptake of traditional medicine as an option for people's well-being, for strengthening their bodies, which is interesting because often within the South African context, the priority is often given to Western medicine. And in this instance, the pandemic has been able to shift the ways that people have engaged with their spirituality and also traditional medicines in South Africa. What other opportunities for us to alleviate this? I think my colleague from Germany has said it, income redistribution. In South Africa currently, there's an opportunity for us to keep advocating for something called the basic income grant. One of the government interventions that have come up during this period is for the government to give unemployed youth or unemployed people in South Africa a basic income grant. And while a basic income grant is something, but what we need to be pushing for, a functional system, income redistribution, and a broader healing, within the context of the country, within the context of how we deal with gender-based violence, with poverty in South Africa. And until that is done, we're always going to be finding ourselves in the back foot of disaster, of pandemics, and of general life. And this is important for how we revision this new normal that we've entered into. I think this is going to be a big readjustment, especially for low-income communities and poor people. And so what does support look like in this period? And how do we keep our governments accountable? In South Africa currently, very, very big issues is the issue of corruption, where a 500 billion rand relief grant has mysteriously, we know it's not mysteriously, gone missing. And so what are the implications of corruption, and how does that impact the poor in South Africa? And how do we factor that conversation in the conversation of income redistribution and holding governments accountable?
Okay, thank you so much, Mase. And actually, it's very inspiring and very important topic. So we are already a little bit beyond our time, but I thought it is very important to get those thoughts together in the outside world. So we would like to see what Wiebke has grasped from that. So please bear with us a few more minutes and we will see what Wiebke designed there.
Hi, everyone. Oh my God, this was... am I on? Sorry.
Yes, we hear you, Wiebke. You can continue, please.
Oh, okay, good. There was a time lag on the two screens. It was such a rich conversation. So first of all, thank you to all the speakers. I'm afraid I was not able to capture everything, but I hope that I've got the essence. And if not, please do add to it. I'm happy to do that afterwards as well. What I hear is common in all the three speakers is that the poverty is increasing everywhere, and it's the social divide, as you can see here, is not only a problem in Germany, but also in South Africa, where the middle class, as well as in Zimbabwe, if I understood that correctly, is actually sliding back into poverty. Especially young people seem to be affected with job loss or not even getting a job in the first place. South Africa has been in constant lockdown since March, which of course is quite something to bear. There is a correlation also between the lockdown and violence, and in general, the problems have to be looked at. Again, that's something that I picked up from all three speakers. The problems are complex. You can't just say, okay, we ban alcohol and then we've got less violence, or we close the schools and then we don't have contagions. We have to look at discernment between reason and risk, is something that I picked up from Mr. Klundt, and also the question if we actually will end up having more deaths from the lockdown effects rather than the actual COVID-19 cases, and an overall trend in both Zimbabwe and South Africa that human rights are not being adhered to. Unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of police brutality, military kind of really stepping on people's rights, burning food on the markets, and taking away the few possibilities of people to look after themselves and after their survival needs, really. I think I'll leave it at that. If you've got,
yes,
there is so much more.
Thank
obviously.
you very much. There's this. I think what we can see very nice from your designs is that it was very a lot of aspects, different aspects which feed into our topic. And Wiebke, if you could mute yourself, then maybe yes, thank you. So I think what is basically for me the essence of this topic is we have learned a lot of poverty increasing, gaps are increasing, and what it looked to me in the end, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that those gaps and those problems we've had existed before, that they are in danger to widen now, poverty might increase. And I have also understood now that there's a lot of topics which are interlinked. Some of those we've touched upon in the last discussions or topics we had in our series, and some we are still going to discuss in the next weeks. So as we discussed and as we heard from the speakers, women's rights, violence, and also education are very much affected. So it would be very interesting to further continue discussion. And I understand the time is very, very limited, and we only touched on the surface on this topic. And I think there needs to be room to really have extensive discussions and talks about this.
Yeah, there are also questions in our chat on Zoom, although, and unfortunately we have no time to answer them now directly. I would say that we think about how we can answer them after that Africa Talks. There is one question from a colleague from our IJP network, our IJP alumnus network. I think he's based in South Africa, and he's asking, he's wondering how the panelists view the threat of a new debt crisis for several African countries, given the news that Zambia is very close to defaulting. This is one, as an example of questions being raised in our chat. We will answer them in the chat afterwards. For now, I will thank you very much for your attendance, all the participants. I will really thank our honored members of that panel. Thank you very much for your participation and your attendance here. That was our first Africa Talks episode. Give us your feedback under Africa Talks at IJP.org or in the chat. We are looking forward to discussing with you another topic next week. Then it's about all education and how about the chances, opportunities for young people to save their jobs, to get into their jobs. Many thanks again to our speakers. See you next week and stay healthy. Good. Bye-bye. Take care.